Great Britain, or the United Kingdom as it's also known, the UK, was formed in 1707 with the Act of Union. This was a big act of legislation that was passed in the Parliament in England, in London, Westminster, and simultaneously passed in the Parliament in Scotland. And what it did is it joined England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland into one country, Great Britain, otherwise known as the United Kingdom, formed in 1707. They would have one government, one monarchy, and one parliament, which would meet in London and Westminster. And the Scottish Parliament would dissolve and meet jointly with the English Parliament. So they'd have a prime minister having the majority in the parliament, running the government day to day, and a king. This period in the beginning of Great Britain also saw changes in their monarchy about the same time. Remember that William and Mary would take power as the monarchs after the Glorious Revolution. Well, they both died, and Mary's sister, they didn't have any children, Mary's sister, Queen Anne, would then rule. And she died in 1714 without any children. So, question for you. When the king and queen die and they don't have kids, and then the sister takes over and she dies, and she doesn't have kids, who do you go to next to be the next monarch? Yeah, you start looking at cousins at that point. That's exactly what they did. So they look, or family that are kind of farther afield on the family tree, right? So at this point, they actually look to the House of Hanover. Hanover is in Germany. It's a big city in Germany. At that time, it was a big principality in Germany. And the royal family in Hanover, the House of Hanover, were related to King James distantly. In fact, George, the king of Hanover, was the great-great-grandson of James. He was the closest they could find that was agreeable to them. So they brought him over to be king, King George I of England and Wales. He would rule from 1714 to 1727. Now, he came from Hanover, which is a German state. So the funny thing about King George I, he never spoke English. He was a king of Great Britain, but never spoke English. He was German, right? Now, his son, he would die in 1727, and his son, George II, also from Hanover, spoke German, but because he had lived a lot of his life in Britain, he learned to speak English. So the second one would. Now, both of these two would spend a lot of their time back and forth between Hanover and England. And as a result of that, the Parliament continued to have a lot of sway in the government, right? So they continue to have the king, in this case George I and II of Hanover, but because they're German, because they have to go back to Hanover from time to time, and because the Parliament already got the upper hand over the Glorious Revolution, Parliament was very strong. And you see some major change in British policies under the rule of these two kings, George I and George II. The first, and I mentioned this before, so I won't go into great detail, is the creation of a prime minister. As a reminder, the British government and the Parliament, which is the elected assembly, right, they make all the laws and pass the taxes. The person that is the head of the government, that runs the government day to day, is the prime minister. He or she, and right now there's a female prime minister, Theresa May, they had the majority in the Parliament, much like the Speaker of the House in the American system. So they had the majority. A lot of political scientists see that as an advantage, by the way. I mean, whatever the prime minister wants to do is pretty much what's going to happen because he or she's got the majority, right? So taxes, laws, whatever, you know what you get. If you don't like it, next election you try to vote them out, and the other party will take over. The prime minister for much of this time period was Robert Walpole. In fact, he was the first prime minister. He's a very shrewd politician, would serve as prime minister, have the majority in the Parliament from 1721 to 1742. Now, during his time period as prime minister, Britain was known for a lot of shady politics. People who got government jobs because they were buddies with Robert Walpole, a lot of money kind of changing hands, shady deals, that sort of thing. Men running government positions that really weren't qualified, but because of their political connections. So Walpole was kind of a shady figure in some respects. However, while he was prime minister, with respect to the colonies, a policy took effect, kind of evolved, that would be very influential for the colonies. This was the policy known as salutary neglect. Salutary neglect, which may sound like an oxymoron. Salutary means good or healthy, and of course you know what neglect means. What might that mean, salutary neglect? I mean, again, it sounds paradoxical or like an oxymoron.
They just let the colonies kind of run themselves.
That's exactly right. From the colonial point of view, that's what they wanted. They were under Great Britain. They still had a lot of connections to Great Britain, governmentally and so forth. But it's kind of a hands-off approach to the colonies. On the ground, let them largely be self-governed, right? So this is called salutary neglect. So it's a very important policy. We'll come back to it when we get to the American Revolution. And that's the way things would operate in the colonies for decades on end. For decades on end. Not everybody in Britain liked Walpole. And again, some of his policies were a bit shady, to say the least. There was an opposition to him. The opposition was called the Country Party, because many of the members of this opposition were country gentlemen. And they would criticize his corrupt practices. They saw them as not only as corrupt, but as corrosive to English liberties. You know, powerful government with money being spent that was wasteful. It was raising taxes, squeezing the people, and all to the benefit of the elite. And the Country Party thought that a government was too big and powerful and taxed too much was a threat to liberty. I don't know if that sounds familiar when it comes to the American Revolution. The Country Party will have a major impact on it. The Country Party also criticized the way elections were done in Britain. In terms of elections, this was a more democratic system, but by our lights would have a lot of problems. In Britain, you had to own property to vote. If you didn't own property, you couldn't vote. So women didn't vote. But what sort of men does it exclude if you have to own property? Poor men, right? So a lot of poor men were not able to vote. So we're talking about middle class and upper class men who were able to vote. So that's a small minority of the population. Also, the way districts were drawn, they were not drawn with equal populations. Think about like congressional districts today. And we have big questions gerrymandering districts that are kind of drawn to benefit one party or the other. Both parties do this, by the way, but that happens. In Britain, there's a lot of gerrymandering, but the districts weren't equal. In other words, you might have a district for parliament in London with thousands of constituents. Then you might have one out in the countryside with a couple hundred. Why is that a problem, by the way? Is that equal representation? No, absolutely not. It also meant that if you're out in the countryside, if you're a wealthy farmer, holding a lot of land, you can pretty much dominate that little election and control who gets elected. And for a good example of this is what Robert Walpole himself. Robert Walpole's family is a wealthy rural family in England, and the little district he was from was a couple hundred voters that his family basically told what to do. Right? These are called rotten boroughs or pocket boroughs that were dominated by wealthy families that could sway the district, could tell voters how to vote or outright bribe them and tell them who to vote for. So the Country Party was critical of those practices as well. But while all this is going on, the last colony of the North American colonies that the British had was founded. This is important to us because this last colony founded at this time period was none other than the colony of Georgia. Georgia, of course, is named after King George II, who granted its charter. Georgia was started in 1732, given a charter named after King George II. The founder of Georgia was James Oglethorpe. James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe was a British politician. He had been a soldier. He was General Oglethorpe as well. And he had this idea for a new colony that would be Georgia. Now, a big issue he wanted to address as part of the colony of Georgia was debtors. In Britain, there were a lot of people who had fallen into debt, and this is a major issue. What happens to you in America if you fall into debt? You can declare bankruptcy if it gets bad enough, which is a very painful financial decision. Your credit's ruined for years to come. It's not pleasant, right? But you're still a free person, generally. I mean, not free to purchase certain things, certainly, but you're out on the streets at least, right? I would not recommend it, by the way, if you can avoid it. Or if you get into debt, you just simply have a lot of bills to pay and life is tough, right? Now, in Britain, if you fell into debt, you could go to jail for being in debt. And you would stay in jail until you paid off your debt. There were debtor prisons, as a matter of fact. Would that put a wrinkle on credit cards or student loans or car payments and the like? You might think twice, right? If you go to prison and stay there. And here's the way prisons worked in Britain at this time. You stayed in prison until you paid the money off. Does anybody see a problem with this? Yeah, if you're in prison, you can't work, and it's just kind of a self-perpetuating. There are people that stayed in prison in terrible conditions for years on end because they were debtors. And what James Oglethorpe wanted to do is to found a colony to help these people just start life fresh. Get them out of jail, clear their debts, send them across the world, and start a new life in Georgia. So Georgia was founded as a place for debtors to get a new life, for the poor, for those in debt. And the prisons for these folks is pretty rough, by the way. I'll show you some images in a little bit. Also, it was thought that Georgia would be a good place to grow silk and wine, which were luxury products back in England, and that was thought, well, that might be a way to make money. Another key purpose of colonial Georgia, and this actually was ended up being its most important purpose by far, see, I would put this down, was to serve as a buffer colony between Spanish Florida and South Carolina. So what I mean by this is a buffer colony. The idea was Britain and Spain were not on friendly terms. They sometimes were at war. Florida was Spanish control. South Carolina was between Florida and Georgia. So if the Spanish were out to attack South Carolina, what would they have to do first? Go through Georgia. Does that make you want to settle in Georgia? Oh, well, you'll be there first and the Spanish will attack you before you get to South Carolina. They didn't advertise that to colonists coming over here, but that was indeed one of its arguably most crucial purposes being founded was to serve as a buffer between South Carolina, which is very prosperous, and Spanish Florida. Now, while Oglethorpe hoped to attract a lot of debtors to Georgia, very few actually came. There's kind of a rumor that Georgia was founded by a bunch of criminals and debtors that actually in reality never happened. Very few debtors and criminals and such came to Georgia. Most people who came over were businessmen and craftsmen. Just people out to start a new life and make a new world who were not criminals or debtors. Oglethorpe came over in 1733 with about 114 British settlers. They founded a city, very quickly set it up, planted on a grid pattern, and this would be the city of Savannah, which was the port city and main capital of Georgia for a number of years in early Georgia history. Early settlers to Georgia got 50 acres for free to farm, which helped attract settlers. Most settlers to Georgia came from Britain, so most of them were British settlers. There were a few Germans that came over. In South Georgia today, there's actually kind of the remnants of this. There were German Lutherans, known as Salzburgers, who were religious refugees, and they helped start the colony of Georgia as well. Now, for many years, Savannah would be the capital of colonial Georgia. People branched out from there, spread down into coastal Georgia, down to Brunswick and the like, down to St. Mary's. And they also went up the Savannah River all the way to present-day Augusta. Augusta was kind of like the frontier in colonial Georgia. Georgia was, by comparison to other colonies, pretty small. But it would prosper. They would make money there. Now, originally, and this is interesting, slavery was banned in Georgia. Oglethorpe thought slavery was immoral. He didn't like it. Thought it was wrong. So while he was in control of early Georgia, slavery was not allowed. However, eventually, he would leave Georgia. In 1749, he goes back to Britain. And after he leaves, the people living there will renege on his ban and will allow African slavery. So by the 1750s, Georgia was very similar to all other southern colonies that had slavery, unfortunately. But Oglethorpe at least started with these good intentions. Well, another important issue developing this same time period is the way colonial governments were structured. Now, because of salutary neglect, the colonies were allowed to run a lot of their own affairs. But some colonies more than others. And there were three different types of government structures for the colonies. Three different types of government structures. The first was what we call a provincial or a royal colony type of government. And these were colonies ruled directly by the British Crown. They had governors. They were all sent over by the king, and they answered the British government. So a provincial or royal colony was the most controlled by the British. They had a governor sent over from Britain. This would include colonies like New Hampshire, New York, Virginia most importantly, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So those are all royal colonies. So again, New Hampshire, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, all royal colonies. The next, and I've kind of hinted at this before, were what we call proprietary colonies. Proprietary colonies. The term proprietary means somebody owns it. So proprietary colony was technically owned by an individual or maybe a group of individuals. And they run it for profit or have a particular purpose in setting up and owning this colony. Now, the reality was there were governors who were sent over that answered the king, but they were less tightly controlled than a royal colony. So if you're wondering, what would be an example of a proprietary colony? Pennsylvania. I mean, who started Pennsylvania? Who owned it technically? William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. It's named after him, right? So that's an example of a proprietary colony. Also, Delaware is an example, New Jersey, and Maryland, which was owned by Lord Baltimore, an English Catholic, right? So these were owned by an individual or a group of individuals, sometimes set up for religious regions, for refugee regions like English Catholics for Maryland, or Quakers for Pennsylvania. Finally, the third type of government structure you had in the colonies was a charter colony. And a colony that was a charter colony, they had a legal document known as a charter that gave them the right to a large measure of self-government. And these charter colonies had the most freedom, the most kind of self-government. Examples of a charter colony would include Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. They've been founded by the Puritans. They had a charter giving them the right to a large measure of self-government. So you can see that all types of these governments they're a little different. They're all under the British Crown, but some are more controlled by the British Crown than others. Well, there were governors in all these cases sent over to the colonies. These were British officials sent over to rule as the governors of the colonies. The way these colonial governments work is the governor came from Britain. He was appointed by the Parliament or by the Crown, and he ran the government in each colony. He had a council to advise him. These were top leading men in the colonies, men like the Attorney General or the head of the colonial militia, who advised the governor. They were his council, right? They advised him on what to do and helped him run the government. However, and this is really important, in this period between 1707 and 1760, many governors deferred to colonial assemblies. In other words, each colony had an assembly elected by the people, and governors often pretty much let the assembly do what it wanted. Pass its own laws, pass its own taxes, and with a few exceptions, let them do it. Think about it for a minute. Imagine you were let's say you were kind of a political person back in Britain. You were a friend of maybe Prime Minister Walpole. And he said, okay, why don't you go be the governor of South Carolina? You're a buddy of mine. That pays pretty well. You go over there. Have you ever been to South Carolina? No. Do you know anything about life there? No. Would you like to keep that high-paying position? Probably so. So when you arrive there, what do you think your main kind of goal as governor is to do? Make money? Keep things going smoothly. Very good. And what that would include is keeping the locals happy, right? If you decide, I want to make all these big changes that they don't like, they're going to get upset with you and complain. And it's going to get back to Britain and people aren't going to be happy and you might lose your nice, cushy job, right? So what I'm getting at is a lot of the governors just, as long as the colonial assemblies aren't doing something wild and crazy, let them do what they want, right? So yes, they're appointed from Britain, but the way things work is that the assemblies had a lot of power. And we'll see this changes during the American Revolution, but throughout much of the 18th century, the assemblies elected by the colonists make a lot of the laws, a lot of the taxes, etc. They're largely self-governed. Now, what about voting in the colonies? Well, it's very similar in Great Britain. You had to own property, had to be a male property owner to vote. However, a big wrinkle to that. Property in Great Britain, property owning was not as common as in the New World. I want you to think about why. Why do you imagine it was a lot more common to own property in these colonies than back in Britain itself? That's right. That's the whole point of a lot of these guys coming over is to get land and get a farm. And so naturally a lot more men had farms. Very, very common. Also another thing to think about. England itself, part of Great Britain is the size of Alabama, roughly. Think of all the American colonies, even at this time period. Are they larger or smaller than Britain? A lot larger, right? So there's a lot more land available. So it's a lot easier to own a farm or own some measure of land in the colonies. So not all men own land. We'll talk about this more later, but a lot more men own land. So my point being is your voting population was much bigger percentage-wise in the colonies than in Great Britain. So in that sense, it's more democratic. However, only white males who own property can vote. So that excludes women, that excludes slaves. Now there's one wrinkle with women. Most women are typically not allowed to vote. There was one exception, and this is kind of interesting. If you were a widow, your husband was dead, and you owned the property for the family, you could vote in some colonies. Why might that be the case? What's the key wrinkle there? Widow, so her husband's dead, so he can't vote, and she controls the property, so she's representing the family in essence, right? So the idea is the person that represents the family votes for the family. Well, if the husband's alive and he owns the property, that's him. But if he's not, that's going to be his wife. So there were a few cases where women were allowed to vote, but typically that was not the case. Oh, another thing about voting, you might find this kind of interesting. How many have voted? I'm not here to tell you your politics or tell you, who to vote for, whatever. What is it like when you actually go to the place and vote? What do you do? Scary? The old lady scary? A bunch of old ladies running. My grandmother used to do this. So you wait in line. Okay, what else? Secret ballot. Very good. It's a private. So you go into this little rickety booth, I guess you might say, and you draw a curtain, or nobody sees what you do, right? Yeah. So we have what we call the secret ballot today. That's a very key feature of our system. Very different in colonial days. You voted in public. So everybody knew who you voted for. Can you imagine doing that today?
Jeez.
Yeah. No pressure, right? No pressure. Everybody knows you vote. Oh, and not only that, there were many cases in colonial America when you went in to vote at the voting booth, the candidates were there.
Oh, okay.
And sometimes they would thank you, like shake your hand like after you voted for them and so forth. That's a little awkward, right? A little awkward by our standards, right? But that was common in their day. Oh, also, candidates kind of bribe voters. It was very common for them to hold like big barbecues before a vote, or to roll out a lot of liquor to get kind of people toasted up, to encourage them to go vote for them, things like that. So we would see this as pretty shady business, but this is how they did it in this day. And we'll see this will continue into early America after the United States becomes its own country as well. So anyway, a little different on the voting standards. Let me show you some of this, particularly with regard to Georgia. So a big problem in England and in Great Britain itself at the time was debtors, and debtors ending up in prison. These are some images of debtors in prisons, or in stockades where they'd be publicly lambasted and put in these, or in prison languishing away. So James Oglethorpe, in founding Georgia, hoped to have Georgia as a refuge for these debtors. That never really worked out. Very few of them came over, but that was at least part of the reason it was technically founded as a new colony. So speaking of Oglethorpe, here is a drawing of Oglethorpe. He was a member of the Parliament. He was a soldier. It's a pretty interesting figure. And he led this first group of colonists, about 114, to found the colony of Georgia. And the first city, of course, was Savannah in 1733. Now, he stayed there for a number of years. Then he went back. And it's only after he went back that they would allow slavery, by the way. So Savannah's planned out on the group. Anybody been to, old Savannah? Seen some of these buildings? Good. I'd encourage you to visit. Savannah's a fun town. Yeah, it's gorgeous. A lot of these buildings date back from this time period even. So, yeah. All right. Well, moving along here. I'd like to talk about some major changes in the demographics and the economy of the colonies in this same period where you have these political changes. One major trend in the American colonies between 1700 and 1760 was very strong population growth. Very strong. And there's two main reasons for this. One is a very high birth rate. By 1700, a lot of the colonies become healthier places to live. Now, certainly more in New England than, say, Virginia and Maryland with all the malaria. But as time went along, the people adjusted to live in these colonies and they became healthier. Land is cheaper. It's easier to start a farm, a family farm. And because of that, a lot of people married younger. I mean, back in Europe, particularly Britain, couples might wait to their mid or late 20s to marry because they didn't really have enough money to do so beforehand. In the American colonies, younger marriages were more common. Late teenagers, early 20s was not uncommon to get married because it's easy to get land and start a farm and support a family. So people are marrying younger. This is an age without birth control. This is an age where if you have a family farm, you want a lot of kids. Why would you want a lot of kids, by the way? Yeah, these are free workers, right? Yeah. And remember, when you get old, this is your retirement plan. You're going to live with your kids, basically. So people wanted a lot of kids. That was natural. So in the American colonies, in this time period we're discussing, roughly 1700 to 1760, it was very common for colonial women to have about 6 to 8 children. Ladies, you can think about that, having 6 to 8 children. And because the conditions were healthy, a lot of those kids lived to adulthood. More so than in Great Britain. Now, there was infant mortality. There were children who died young. But, if a woman had 6 to 8 kids, maybe 4, 5, 6 of them would live to adulthood. What does that do over time if your average woman is having 6 to 8 kids and raising a lot of them to adulthood? The population is going to double or more within every generation, right? So that contributes to pretty strong population growth. The other factor contributing to population growth was immigration. So you can have your own kids, obviously, within your own place, but the other way you can increase your population is bringing other people in, so immigration. Now, there would continue to be English immigrants coming over, certainly. But between 1700 and 1760, a whole host of new groups of people came over that had never really come over in large numbers before. Not in large numbers, at least. And this would lead to a great deal of ethnic diversity. So I want to highlight a couple of these major immigrant groups coming over at the time. The first, and arguably the biggest group coming over, were the Scots and the Scotch-Irish. So you might wonder, who are these people? Well, the Scots are pretty straightforward. They're from Scotland, right? The Scotch-Irish were people of Scottish origin that were living in Northern Ireland. There had been Scottish settlers who had settled in Northern Ireland, and there's a substantial population there. So they're also ethnically and culturally, religiously Scottish. So the Scots and the Scotch-Irish. So why did these folks come over in this period? The main reason is economics. Back in Northern Ireland, back in Scotland, farmers had fallen on hard times. Many of them were renters, and the landlords had jacked the rents up considerably. So they were being squeezed economically back in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So as a result of this, wave after wave after wave of Scottish and Scotch-Irish immigrants came over in this time period. And the main thing they're doing is they're looking for cheap land. They want to start anew, get land for their family. Because life is tough as a farmer in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Now, some of them would settle in the north. One colony that really attracted Scots and Scotch-Irish, and you see a large number of people with this ancestry today, is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania this day has a lot of people with Scottish and Scotch-Irish origin. But many of them came to the south, particularly along the frontier in Appalachia. Appalachia today, from Pennsylvania all the way down to the south, has a lot of people of Scottish and Scotch-Irish origin. In fact, here in the south, in 1860, three out of four white Southerners had Welsh or Scotch-Irish ancestry. So a lot of people in the South today even still have Scottish and Scottish-Irish ancestry. How many here know that you have Scottish or Scotch-Irish ancestry? Okay, a lot of hands going up. If you do some ancestral research, you might, those of you who don't have your hands up, you might find you have some Scotch or Scotch-Irish ancestry. On my mother's side, I've got Scotch-Irish ancestry, by the way. So it's very, very common. So they heavily influenced the South and even some places in the North like Pennsylvania, the culture there. Now what about the Scotch-Irish? Well, a couple of things about them as people. Again, they're settling on the frontier, Appalachia, the South, Pennsylvania, very big. First off, religiously, they're typically Presbyterian. That's where Presbyterian churches have a lot of their early roots from. And of course, Presbyterians follow the theology of John Calvin, their reform. Over time, though, some of them will become Baptist. The Scotch and Scotch-Irish speak English, so they have that to their advantage, although certainly with an accent, as you well know, right? Sometimes a very thick accent. In terms of their culture, the Scots and Scotch-Irish are noted for being very loyal to family. Family is a big part of their culture. You can see this in Southern culture today. They have a reputation as being very good soldiers and frontiersmen, and that would play a big role in American society. But they also were noted for enjoying fighting. As a people, they're a fighting people. They like to fight each other. They like to fight others. like to fight the English, like to fight the natives when they come over here. So they kind of have a rough reputation. We'll talk about Southern culture later on. The South will be noted for more fighting and violence and all that. And that has a strong echo of Scots and Scotch-Irish culture. If you want to read about this, there's a book called Born Fighting that details a whole, and you can look it up on Amazon, that details this whole Scottish and Scotch-Irish influence on Southern and even on other parts of American culture. Well, besides the Scots and Scotch-Irish, another group that came over were the Germans. The Germans. The Germans came from German states. They're also the Swiss-speaking part of Germany, which sent some immigrants as well. And like the Scots and Scotch-Irish, they largely came over for economic reasons, to start a new life, to make more money and have a better life. But in some cases, wars and religious persecution brought some of them over as well. Now, most Germans came to middle colonies, middle Atlantic colonies. Pennsylvania would have a lot of Germans. But they also moved to the west, and a few places moved to the south. In South Carolina, for instance, had big pockets of Germans as well. Now, the Germans tend to cluster in their own little communities in colonial days. So they maintained their own culture, they maintained their own religion. Most of them were Lutheran or Reformed, and they kind of stuck together. So as a result of this, at the time of the American Revolution, there were pockets of Germans living throughout the colonies, and a lot of them still spoke German, interestingly enough. Now finally, this period also saw a large number of African slaves brought over the colonies. And sadly, they were brought over as slaves, and as we know, the laws were increasingly tightened up that would not allow them to get out of slavery. And the first slaves brought over were basically treated like indentured servants, and most of them got their freedom. But after Bacon's Rebellion, in 1676, the laws were tightened up, and slavery became a more permanent status. So Africans being brought over against their will, the only group brought over against their will. What about these African slaves coming over? Well, the largest concentration of them went to the southern colonies, like Virginia. And by the way, in 1750, Virginia had about 40% of its population as slaves. But again, a substantial number went to the middle Atlantic colonies. Port cities like Philadelphia and New York had substantial African slave populations. And on grand total, by the time of the American Revolution in 1776, 20% of the American colonies were made up of African slaves. So they're a substantial minority. So a little more about African slaves. We'll talk about them more later, but they would add to the diversity of the colonies in a big way. So what's the takeaway from this? The population. In 1720, it's estimated the American colonies had about 400,000 people, grand total. 13 colonies, 400,000 people in 1720. By 1765, that had gone up to 2 million. So we're talking birth and immigration, large population growth. 400,000 in 1720 to 2 million roughly in 1765. So this greatly changed the colonies. Also, by the way, one last remark about this. By 1765, half the people living in the colonies had no English ancestry. Think about it. You've got Germans, you've got Dutch, you've got Scotch and Scotch-Irish and Africans. That's a lot of people, grand total. So about half the people were not of English origin. Well, they spoke English, right? They're not of English origin. Well, this time period also saw some major changes in the Atlantic economy, that would influence the colonies as well. The bigger picture and then the little picture of where they were. The first thing is that in terms of all the colonies, whether they're English or French or Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, etc., raw materials were becoming more important to the economy. And in Europe, the raw materials that were the most popular came from more tropical areas, such as Brazil or the Caribbean island, or on the North American colonies, the southern colonies. But that's because you need a warm climate to grow these things. So tobacco was very popular back in Europe. So tobacco grown in Virginia, which is a British colony, or tobacco grown in Cuba, a Spanish colony, right? That was a popular product. Or rice grown along the coast of South Carolina, for instance, a popular product. Or indigo, likewise grown in South Carolina. However, the biggest, most important raw material grown, by far, was sugar. In fact, in this time period, historians talk about this as the period of the sugar revolution. I want you to think about this for a minute. Before the 18th century, Europeans had very little sugar in their diet. Most of it was maybe fruit that they got seasonally, but after that, little sugar. I want you to imagine, think about your diet today. I'm looking around this room even at drinks and things. How much sugar do we have in our diets? A lot. Can you imagine your diet with hardly any sugar? Maybe? No, I'm seeing head shaking. Would some of you go through withdrawals? Probably. There's some scientists studying this today that think sugar is addictive. You might think they might have something to that. Maybe, maybe not. Now, what I want you to imagine is your diet with very little sugar, and then sugar is introduced. What will you start doing in terms of your food and beverage purchases? No sugar, then sugar introduced. You're going to start buying more of it, right? Naturally. Human body starts craving sugar at some point, right? So once sugar is introduced to Europe, Europeans really want it. It creates a big demand for sugar. Big, even more so than tobacco in many cases, right? So sugar becomes incredibly popular in Europe overall. This is called the time of the sugar revolution. Sugar revolution. So sugar became really important, and sugar is grown in the Caribbean and in Brazil. The Caribbean and Brazil. Now for Britain's colonies, sugar was primarily grown in their Caribbean colonies. This is not the 13 colonies on North America, but in their Caribbean colonies. So places like Jamaica, Barbados, the Bermuda Islands, these are all British possessions. For the French, they had what's now Haiti. Or for the Spanish, they had Cuba. The Portuguese had Brazil. So the English or the British aren't the only ones with these kind of sugar-producing colonies. But for the British, the small Caribbean colonies like Jamaica, Barbados, Bermuda that produced sugar were worth far, far more than their North American colonies. And to show you how important sugar was, in Jamaica, they grew very little food. They imported a lot of their food from the American colonies. Why? There's more money in sugar. What food is cheap, right? Just import it from Pennsylvania or wherever. I'm just making it up, right? Every little strip of land you've got in Jamaica, you're going to be growing sugar cane to make money off sugar, right? So it's a money-making issue, really, is what it comes down to. You can import your food. No big deal, right? You can't grow food in Jamaica. They just weren't doing it because they could make more money growing sugar, right? So these sugar growing islands were actually worth a lot more than the American colonies, money-wise, because sugar was so valuable. It's really hard to estimate the value of sugar. And a lot of farmers here in the American colonies made money selling excess food to these Caribbean colonies, like Jamaica, Barbados, etc. Sugar it was processed. It was from sugar cane, and that's really hard work, by the way, very laborious. They would turn it into raw sugar. They would make molasses, and another product in the Caribbean, rum, right? So all these things were a way they would transport sugar back to Europe itself. This time period is also a time period of what we call the consumer revolution. The consumer revolution. There were major changes in consumption patterns in Britain's North American colonies that we call the consumer revolution. So the American colonies are producing all these raw materials and food that they're selling. And their population's growing. And that means that they want more consumer goods. So they're buying these things, manufactured goods from Britain. Things like furniture or clothing or clocks or guns, tools, kitchenware, even things like tea are all being bought from Great Britain. Well, this stimulates the British economy. By the way, by 1770, 2/5 of all British exports are going to the American colonies. So there's a big trading relation between the two. So the Americans are selling raw materials, and they're buying all these consumer products from the mother country, Great Britain, part of mercantilism, right? Well, a couple of things historians note about this consumer revolution. Two things. One, the standard of living is going up in the American colonies. And the reason most historians argue this is we can see the goods that most colonists were buying. Colonists begin to own more pair of clothing. They own better furniture. They own better kitchenware and the like. That's kind of what we call physical culture, right? I mean, if you walk into somebody's home, let's imagine two homes. You walk into a home in 1720 that doesn't have a lot of furniture. You can tell they don't own a lot of clothing. It's kind of bare bones. You walk into another home 20 years later in 1740, they've got nice furniture, they've got clothing, etc. It's the same family. What does that tell you is happening in those 20 years?
Their standard of living went up.
That's exactly right. So historians say the consumer revolution is clear evidence, just physically speaking, that life is getting better and the standard of living is actually going up in the colonies. So that's the first big takeaway. Standard of living is going up because of the consumer revolution. There is a downside to it, though. And we still deal with this as Americans today. This goes back way into American history. A lot of Americans, the way they got these goods, they went into debt. Particularly wealthy Americans. They would have lines of credit with merchants in London, and so there was a fair amount of debt by 1765. But still, Americans overall were living better. Now, part of the reason that they were able to do all this trade was because of the rise of colonial port cities. So if you're a farmer, maybe growing tobacco in Virginia or growing food in Pennsylvania, whatever example you want to give, you're growing enough food for your own family, and then you're selling it on the Atlantic economy. And to sell things and then buy goods that you want from Great Britain, you have to go through the main ports. So a lot of these port cities really developed because of this trade. The largest colonial port cities were as follows. Up in New England, be Boston, and the main port city up in New England. Going further south would be New York, very important port city with a very good harbor. Then Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies, also a major port city. Then down in the south, the biggest port city was Charleston. I mean, Savannah was also important, but Charleston was much, much bigger. Well, despite all this economic growth, a major problem for trade was a lack of currency. Lack of currency. In many cases, Americans used what was called commodity money. That's where you pay for a good with a commodity. For instance, if you're a tobacco farmer, you might have barrels of tobacco that you've got together. You might trade that, kind of peg something with currency with tobacco. But that's very inefficient. In 1690, colonial Massachusetts was one of the first places in the world, outside of China at least, to issue paper money. They're trying to create some new currency, and paper money was actually used. However, we'll come back to this again because this will be a major theme in early America. Many people distrusted paper money. They preferred hard currency, silver or gold. Is that strange to you guys? People didn't trust or like paper money?
Makes sense. I mean, you can counterfeit it pretty easy.
That's right. You can counterfeit it easy. Particularly, we have sophisticated machinery that can make it harder today, but they don't have this, right? Why else might people distrust it? Besides, counterfeiting is a huge issue. I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, our money today is relatively tough. And back then, though, it was just got wet, got messed up. It was you lost your $20.
Right. It's harder to secure in that sense. You're right. A rainstorm is not going to destroy your silver coin, right? Exactly. And another thing is paper. Just a piece of paper, right? I can't tangibly really feel that or know that it's worth something versus silver or gold. We've come to trust paper money, but in this time they hadn't yet. So paper was not quite trusted. We'll come back to this theme again. But paper money was not always accepted by some merchants, by the way. You wouldn't trust it. So the lack of good currency was a major problem that inhibited trade. Another problem they had at the time was smuggling. Remember, mercantilism, you're only supposed to trade with Great Britain. However, not everybody wanted to do that. Nor did everybody want to pay all the British taxes. So smuggling was a major issue at the time. People did that to trade with other European powers or to avoid taxes with the British. Now, how might you smuggle goods? I mean, there are colonial officials that are collecting taxes and are kind of watching this. How might you get around those folks? You got to think devious.
They got dirt on somebody.
Close, yeah.
Bribery?
Bribery. Yeah, bribery was very common. If there's a colonial tax official in, say, New York City, and you want to smuggle goods, or Boston, pay a little money on the table, and they'll look the other way. That was exceedingly common in colonial America. A lot of these customs officials, by the way, were not paid very well. And anytime you have government officials that are kind of minding these things and are not paid well, bribery is a big temptation, by the way. So there was a lot of smuggling going on. Part of this was the whole mentality of salutary neglect, by the way. Kind of lax enforcement, let them do what they want, right? So that was part of it. Well, let me show you some of this, and then We're going to turn to class and slavery in a little more detail. So I mentioned this is the time of growing families because of birth rate. This is a portrait of the Peel family in New York. And you see here children and the extended family and all this. This is a time period of big population growth. And a big part of this was high birth rate on the one hand, strong immigration on the other. And women having a lot of children and a lot of new immigrants coming over. Speaking of the immigration, this made colonial America a lot more ethnically diverse. And when you think of colonial America, you probably think of just these English people coming over. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. Between roughly 1707 and 1765, on this map, this shows you the immigrant routes. Now, there's a lot of English people, no doubt about it, English and tan. The most homogeneous area is New England. Almost everybody in New England is still of English background. But if you start going down the Middle Atlantic colonies, yes, you've got English people, but you've also got Dutch in New York and New Jersey. You've got a lot of Germans in Pennsylvania. And Scotch-Irish in Pennsylvania. Moved down into Virginia, yeah, you've got a lot of English, but you've also got Africans, and you've got Scotch-Irish on the frontier, and same thing in the rest of the southern colonies. So the point here is there's a lot more ethnic diversity, religious diversity, because of all these immigrants. Again, by 1765, only about half the population was of strict English descent. The rest are African, German, Scotch-Irish, etc. Dutch, and on and on. You get a little bit of smattering of, Swedish or French or what have you. Well, another big thing economically are these sugar revolutions. And this shows you the Caribbean, where a lot of sugar was grown. And this included British colonies, included Spanish, French, Dutch, etc. And that's where all the money was being made. A lot more money being made in sugar than anything else. And again, these British colonies, they would actually import food. So some British colonies, for England, Jamaica right here. We think of it as a nice vacation spot today. In this era, that's where you grow sugar and make big money. Or Bermuda, Barbados, this area, same sort of thing. It's very tropical. It's a good place to grow sugar cane. It's also the time of the consumer revolution. American colonists buying more products, their standard of living going up. And we see this from just sort of the physical culture of the day. This is examples of the things you might buy. Things like kitchenware or coloring, right? And these are things they're purchasing back from England, along with clothing, furniture, tools, tea. Life is getting better overall. This kind of this drive for consumerism. Huge increase. Now, going along with all this are an increase in port cities. You see this all throughout the colonies. There's a whole host of small and large ports. The four big ports, though, were Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston down in the south. By the way, Newport, Rhode Island was also considerable, and you see a whole host of smaller ones as well. This connects the colonies to the broader Atlantic economy. All right. Any questions so far? Well, the last thing I want to cover today is slavery and class in the American colonies. Class was very important back in Great Britain. There was a big gulf between the wealthy and the poor, between property owners and the poor workers down beneath. Class would also be important in the American colonies, in some more than others. And another big wrinkle, of course, would be slavery in the American colonies. By the time of the American Revolution, there were nearly 400,000 people in the American colonies that were slaves. So what about slavery? What about class? Well, first, slavery. It's a misnomer that there were no slaves in northern colonies. That's a common, popular assumption, but it's simply not true. Now, there were fewer slaves in northern colonies, and slavery did not dominate the economy or society, but they did have slaves. First, starting in the New England colonies, right? Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, etc. In the New England colonies, only about 3% of the population were slaves. So they did have slaves, but they were a tiny minority in New England. If you move further south in the Middle Atlantic colonies, the slave population jumps up. In fact, in some Middle Atlantic colonies, it would be between maybe 10 or 15% of the population. So there's still a minority, but there's more slavery in the Middle Atlantic colonies than New England. So for instance, New York City had a very large slave population. Philadelphia in Pennsylvania had a large slave population. A lot of these were urban slaves. So what would life be like if you were a slave in, say, in the New England colonies or the Middle Atlantic colonies? It would be very different than the South. Most slave owners only own a few slaves at most. You don't have large plantations in the North. By the way, why wouldn't you have large plantations in Massachusetts? You ever thought about that? It's too cold, right? You can't grow tobacco, and later we'll get to it, cotton in Massachusetts. It just does not work, right? So that means that having a plantation is not profitable. It's just not a moneymaker. So what sort of things would slaves do then if they're not working on big, tobacco plantations and the like?
Household duties.
Yeah, a lot of it, frankly, was household duties. Like a wealthy person who has a slave as his servant or as a family cook, or to do chores around the house. Or maybe a blacksmith who has an assistant who's his slave, right? So what that means is that if you're a slave, you commonly learn a skill of some sort, and you have a lot of personal daily contact with your master. Now, if that master is very mean, life is hard, right? But if they're at least tolerable, life would be okay. Also, what it meant is if you were from Africa, you adapted to colonial culture very quickly. Think about learning another language. What if you're in contact with somebody who speaks that language every day, and that's your job? Will you learn that language pretty quick? Yeah. Maybe it might take you 6 months, maybe a year, but you will learn. Eventually, you'll be fluent, right? Now, that's going to be very different in the South, where African slaves were around African slaves most of the time instead of white masters. So they acculturate a lot faster in the North. They adopt the language, the culture, the religion, etc. a lot quicker in northern colonies than in the South. What about class in the North? Well, in the New England colonies and Middle Atlantic colonies, yes, they're definitely the wealthy and the poor. As in any society, there's a class structure. Wealthy, middle class, poor, etc. However, in the North, class is a little more egalitarian. There's a little more of a rejection of the sort of elitism and aristocracy that you would see back in Britain. Well, that said, northern colonies, whether it's New England or the Middle Atlantic colonies, they had a major issue with these demographic changes, population growth. One issue is they're smaller. So as the population grows, this creates a lot of land shortages and major changes to the family and a crisis of their society, what we call freehold society. New England was known as a freehold society. What I mean by that, freehold is a family of farmers where they own the land, and it's a yeoman farmer. I might put that term on the board. A yeoman farmer is a family farmer. It's another term for freehold. This is a family farmer. So this is a farming family with a husband and wife. They own the land free and clear, freehold. They grow enough crops to feed their family and sell a little bit on the market where they can buy goods. What does that mean in terms of your boss?
You're your own boss.
You're your own boss. I mean, you're a little kind of a mom and pop operation, right? There's a lot of freedom in that. You do what you want. On the other hand, just like any small business, you have to suffer the consequences if you don't run things well, right? Personally, suffer the consequences, right? So this is the kind of society it was. This is kind of based on individualism, freedom. Land ownership also equates to voting rights, participation in the community, town halls where you vote in public. And the way this worked in the family is that marriage was commonly done in your kind of teens and 20s. The father of the family is supposed to get land to pass down to his sons. Why would his sons need land?
Grow their own family.
Grow their own family. It's like a cycle, right? Once they get land, they can have their own kids, and life continues. Well, this became an issue because of all of the population growth. By the way, if you're wondering how did they date in colonial America, well, it was courting. If a young man was interested in a young woman, he would go courting to her house. So he would spend time with her family and with her in the household. He might have dinner with her. This would include sometimes spending the night. Now, they're a little trepidatious about what might happen with that. Anybody heard of bundling? Seen this? Anybody seen The Patriot where they do this?
I think I know what you're talking about. It's like when they
They sew you up in the sheet.
Yeah.
Yeah, they sew you up in the sheets or put a board between the couple because they're a courting couple. We want them to grow close and eventually get married, but we don't get too close, if you know what I mean, because that can have some negative consequences. So there's a way, because and the travel is hard, so the young man might have to stay the night, right, if the weather's bad and so forth. So bundling was a way in New England that they had courting life. As you can imagine, some couples got out of the bundling and did things at night, but nonetheless, they tried this sort of thing. Well, as time went along, this whole arrangement got hard because as the population growth, there's less and less land available to pass down to sons. So, huge population growth in New England. New England went up from 100,000 people in 1700 to 40,000 in 1750. So this created a lot of pressure. It created a crisis of the freehold society. So here's what families did to try to cope with this. Well, they tried to have fewer children. But the birth control is kind of primitive, so that doesn't really work that well. And the rhythm method is only somewhat effective. Some farmers worked together. They started planting high crop yields like potatoes and corn and barley, or tried to exchange goods. They would also, to try to help their sons out, they would actually put off the age of marriage. So like send their children out to be indentured servants for a few years before letting them get married. Finally, sometimes they go move out in the frontier in search of land, new land, like to New Hampshire, Vermont, or Massachusetts. Now, how might you feel if your father is postponing your age of marriage for money reasons, both men and women?
Not great.
Why might you not like it? You want to start your life and get married to this girl you like, and he's saying, no, you've got to work as an indentured servant for a couple of years. Would that irritate you? Ladies, the same thing might be happening to you, too. Why might that be irritating?
Because the prospect may be gone when you're back.
Yeah. You're only getting older, and maybe you break up between now and then. What else?
You miss out on various advantages of being married.
Yeah. You're celibate and lonely. You're poor. And once you get married and start a farm, you can start making money, right? So a lot of young people didn't like it. This created really tension in society, right? Created tension in families. It led to the breakdown of the father's authority in some cases. And one thing historians have documented, the premarital pregnancy rates went through the roof. Because beforehand, if you could expect to get married in your late teens, early 20s, it's pretty easy to kind of wait to get married, right? If now they're saying, well, now you need to wait to 25 or 27, that's kind of hard, right? So by the 1740s, 30% of brides in New England were going down the aisle pregnant. So that's kind of shotgun marriages became a lot more common. Some historians think that couples were doing that to force the hand of the father, right? To force him to do something about the situation. How would you guys feel about this? I mean, you guys are young. What would you do if your parents you want to get married at X date, and they say, no, you need to put that off a couple years? How would you cope? For money reasons, right?
You'd probably be in the sort of rebellious phase, and
Yeah.
especially if you're like a late teenager, and you probably go against your wishes.
Yeah. How many would you like your parents to tell you when to get married or not? Any takers on that? No? All right, think about it, right? So this created some real tensions in colonial families in the 1730s, 1740s, particularly New England. Because New England colonies were smaller, there's a lot less land to go around. So this idea of land ownership, freehold society was pretty big. What about the middle Atlantic colonies? Moving along further south, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, they saw similar problems as the New England colonies. So population growth there created similar kind of pressures and issues within families. However, one thing to keep in mind, land ownership was not as common in the middle Atlantic colonies. In other words, in New England, the expectation was land ownership was normal. The yeoman farmer was the model. Middle Atlantic colonies, in some cases, people were already renters, so it was not quite the same expectations. For instance, in New York, along the Hudson River Valley, most people there were renters. There were wealthy farmers that owned the land, and people leased farms there. So a lot of people were landless whites. Also, again, Middle Atlantic colonies are a lot more culturally diverse than the New England colonies. It's okay. It's okay. My phone will probably ring at some point. Anyway, well, lastly, let's move along to the South. What about class and slavery in the South? The Southern colonies were slave-based societies. That's very important to know. It's not just that they had slavery. The economy of the South revolved around slavery. The backbone of the labor force, cheap labor again is a big issue, were slaves. And this also had a huge impact on the class structure of the South. So at the very top of the South are what we call the gentry, the Southern gentry. This is the top of Southern society. These are the wealthy whites. They own a lot of land, and they own a lot of slaves. Their wealth is based on land and slaves. They grow big cash crops like tobacco, or in South Carolina along the coast, rice or indigo. And they're very wealthy. They control the politics, they control the economics of their colony. Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, and so forth. Culturally, they kind of model themselves on the aristocracy, the nobility of England. They consider themselves like the nobility of the New World. They copy their fashions, their styles. They even send their sons to be educated in England among the English elite. They hire tutors for their daughters to teach them how to be proper ladies. Again, they think of themselves as like the nobility of the New World. And their wealth is based on land and slaves. Well, down below this wealthy elite, the gentry, you have other white Southerners. First, you have a middle class, a small middle class in the South. This would consist of skilled professionals, doctors, lawyers, artisans, like a blacksmith, a shop owner, or maybe a minister. In some cases, a yeoman farmer. There were also a lot of poor whites living along the frontier or without land, and their fortunes were very much less because of the wealthy. When the wealthy buy out the best farmland, they drive the wages down because they own slavery, they own slaves, and so forth. You might wonder, if you were a middle class or a poor white, why might you support this system? There are a couple of reasons that a lot of them kind of support this system. One is they were citizens. They were above slaves. They could vote. They sometimes were given tax breaks, government positions, and they wanted to become wealthy, and that was their model of wealth. And on a negative side, one thing that united all whites, whether you were wealthy or not, was a fear of a slave revolt. This was the utter terror of Southern whites, violent slave revolt. Whether you were wealthy or not, fear of a slave revolt. Good example of this, a very famous case in colonial America, was the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. And here's what happened in South Carolina. 1739, a group of slaves in South Carolina revolted. And this occurred along the Stono River right outside of Charleston, hence the name Stono Rebellion. Their goal was to get to Spanish Florida, which did not have slavery, so they'd be free there. So on their way to Florida and South Carolina, they burned down about half a dozen plantations. They attacked small farms and shops, and they killed over 20 whites. And these were rebelling slaves. They didn't care whether you were a slave owner or a poor white. If you got in their way, they're trying to get out of Dodge, they would kill you. 20 whites were killed. Well, the South Carolina militia was called up to squash this revolt, which they did. They caught all the slaves and they killed all of them. They massacred them. Now, to make an example of these slaves, what they did after they killed them is they cut all their heads off and they put their heads on the post leading on the road to Charleston, South Carolina. Think about it. What if you drove into campus this morning and along every mile was the head of somebody? A little post. Would you think twice about rebelling if you were a slave in that case? Yeah, they made an example of these folks, right? But here's the deal. Again, if you were poor or a wealthy white, if a slave revolt happened, you might get killed. You might get caught up in it. That's what happened in Stono. Well, last, but certainly not least, what was the impact of slavery for African Americans? The impact is obviously the largest on African Americans. They're the ones enslaved. In many southern colonies, they were the largest percentage of the population. In fact, the majority of colonial South Carolina was made up of slaves. In other colonies, they were a considerable portion. Most slaves who came to Britain's North American colonies, by the way, came from West Africa. So if you're an African American, you probably have West African ancestry. It's very, very common. Most African Americans today have a lot of ancestry from countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Sierra Leone. These are West African countries, along with a few African countries like Senegal, Gambia, and Angola. Now, living conditions were not good for African slaves brought to southern colonies, but they were better than the Caribbean. Sugar plantations were the worst place to be, or was the mines in Brazil. Very much better in southern colonies. However, again, the slavery practiced in southern colonies was race-based slavery. You're a slave because of your race. This became encoded in southern colonial laws. Beginning in Virginia, then in South Carolina, if your mother was a slave and of African origin, you were a slave. Those became the laws in southern colonies. Also, laws in southern colonies like South Carolina, from the very beginning, legalized harsh treatment of slaves. So in South Carolina, just to use that example, it was completely legal to beat a slave, to brand a slave, with a hot iron, to castrate a slave if you wanted to, or to kill them for resisting. There's no punishment for murdering a slave, by the way. So your punishment could be very harsh because legally it was allowed. Now, if you were a slave, you were worked on a plantation typically, and there were two main ways slaves were worked, two main systems of work in the southern colonies. And these were on plantations. The first is what we call the gang system of labor. And you would not want this if you could help it. The gang system of labor. In this system, slaves were put in large groups called a gang. You might be 10, 20 slaves. They were closely watched by a white overseer or a black slave known as a slave driver who had a whip, who would whip them and beat them if they were not working. So if you're in the gang system of labor, it's a big group of slaves, but you're watched over and you're really pushed to work hard. The second system of labor was called the task system of labor. Now, under the task system of labor, you were given a certain task to do, like go plant that field, go hoe the garden, whatever. Go plant the new rice crop or whatever. Once you finish your task, you were free. So if you got what you had assigned to you do, you could do something else. Which would you prefer? Somebody looking over your shoulder the whole time, or saying, go do that job and then you're on your own? Obviously, right? The second system was a lot easier, was a lot better. Now, this task system of labor was very commonly used along rice plantations near Charleston, for instance, because a lot of the planters didn't want to live there because they got malaria. Slaves, on the other hand, coming from Africa, were more accustomed to that, and because of they developed a resistance to malaria, could survive better on rice plantations. So this task system of labor gave slaves at least a little bit more freedom. In fact, some slaves on this task system of labor would actually work gardens and have their own things they would do on the side. Well, the last thing here today, what about African American communities and culture? Well, African slaves came from different African nations and different tribes, from Angola or from Senegal or Ghana or wherever. They would intermarry and mix over time. They would preserve some aspects of African culture, food, music, dance. They would also adapt a lot of English culture. They'd learn to speak the English language. Eventually, many of them would become Christian, Protestants. But the language they spoke, particularly on the coast of Georgia and the Carolinas, would often blend African languages and English. For instance, along the Georgia coast, there's what's called the Gullah and Geechee cultures. These were cultures and languages that combined English and a variety of African languages. In addition, African American slaves would preserve a lot of African culture. African dance, African music, and African food would all be brought here and preserved and actually spread in colonial America. Foodways is a good example. African slaves brought a lot of food customs from West Africa that would later greatly influence Southern cuisine. In fact, you can make an argument that Southern cuisine, soul food especially, comes directly out of West Africa. I'll give you a few examples of this. Okra. How many people like okra? Okra is an African plant. How many people like Cajun food, like gumbo or jambalaya? That has very strong African roots, by the way. I'll give you an example. Also, what about fried food? Anybody like fried chicken? Fried ham? Very common way to cook food in West Africa was to fry it. West Africans love fried food. So that's another southern food that's fried, has strong West African roots because of that. Also, some other things that African slaves became good at cooking: sweet potatoes, cornbread, black-eyed peas. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Yes, a lot of southern food has some very strong West African roots because of this. Why and so? Well, African slaves brought their own foods here, and on plantations, guess who did the cooking in the house? Slaves, right? So they got to cook what they wanted to cook, right? Or what they were more good at. So African slaves would have a huge impact on culture in the South. We'll come back to this later, but it's very important for Southern culture. Let me show you some of this and we'll stop for today. I've got some paper to pass back. So, slavery. Slavery was all over the colonies. It's in this number that it was only in the South. You see various percentages here in New England colonies, and then bigger in the Middle Atlantic, like New York and Pennsylvania, but really heavy in the South. Not exclusive to the South, but very, very heavy in the South. More slave-based societies. Slave revolts did occur. They were rare because if you were involved in a revolt as a slave, you would be killed. But a good example of this is the 1739 Stoner Revolt outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And again, the biggest terror for Southern whites was a violent slave revolt, which they might get caught up in and killed. Now, if you're a slave, you have a reason to revolt, right? Okay. Well, I will leave you with this unpleasant image, but it was reality. So we will stop here and continue.